The Russian cargo vessel Port Olia 4 eased away from its berth at the Caspian port of Olia in Russia's Astrakhan region. If a Ukrainian drone could navigate hundreds of kilometers to blast a cargo ship in Russia's own inland sea, then no port, no refinery, and no logistics hub was beyond reach.
At 3:49 a.m., one Ukrainian drone broke through Russia's Caspian defense net. Moments later, a shipment worth about $22 million, packed with hundreds of Shahed drones, artillery shells, and key electronics, was consumed by fire. The explosion ripped through the port, sending secondary blasts across the shoreline. The strike didn't just destroy cargo. It exposed how a low-cost UAV, supported by decoys and electronic disruption, could outmaneuver layered radars and missile systems designed to guard an entire coastline. Stay with me, because this wasn't only about the strike itself. The real story begins long before impact, with how Ukraine managed to shadow the vessel across the Caspian without ever being seen. Tracking the floating arsenal. Tracking began with a single ship that stood out from the flow of tankers and fishing boats crossing the Caspian. This wasn't just any vessel. It was nearly 600 feet long, a reinforced steel cargo hauler displacing over 13,200 tons. Sources vary on the exact figure, and it carried an estimated $22 million worth of military cargo from Iran. Containers were labeled as civilian goods, but inside were components and ready-to-use systems meant to resupply Russia's war effort. When it docked at Olia port, Moscow saw a secure bridge for the front. Ukraine saw an exposed arsenal. On paper, Olia port sat behind a fortress of sensors and interceptors. Buk-M3 batteries, medium-range surface-to-air missiles, covered the airspace. Pantsir-S1 units, rapid reaction point defense, ringed the shoreline. Long-range surveillance radars and coastal patrols filled the gaps. To Russian planners, the corridor across the Caspian was airtight. A control grid built to track fighters, drones, and missiles before they ever closed in. That belief created confidence, and confidence breeds routine. Ukraine didn't challenge the fortress head-on. It didn't need to. The operation instead focused on staying invisible while mapping every detail of the target. Reconnaissance teams began before the ship even left its berth in Iran. Cargo manifests hinted at what was inside. Electronic interception picked up route signals that revealed departure times and vector. Civil maritime observers hidden in the normal traffic of tankers and barges maintained visual pacing without raising suspicion. Think of it as trailing a vehicle in rush hour traffic. You match speed and distance so perfectly that the driver never knows you exist. That's how Port Olia 4 was followed across every mile of the Caspian. Watching, recording, never seen. The key was integration. Signals intelligence gave position and timing. Human eyes verified course and identified the cargo containers. Satellite imagery added overhead confirmation, stitching the intelligence picture into a seamless map. It meant Ukraine knew not just where the freighter was, but what it carried when it would tie up at Olia port and what defensive radar fields overlapped the area. That mattered tactically, with a profile of cargo, docking schedule, and defense posture. Planners didn't have to improvise during the strike. They could shape deception, timing, and weapon choice with precision hours before the first drone launched. The ship wasn't a mystery target by the time it entered the harbor. It was a mapped objective, already broken down into vulnerabilities. Russia misread its own defenses. Buk-M3 launchers waited for radar tracks. Pantsir-S1 vehicles scanned for low-flying targets, and surveillance radars swept arcs across the sea. All of it looked formidable, but only against threats that played by those rules. The system guarded the obvious approaches, while the real danger slipped into blind spots. It's the difference between aiming guns at the front gate while leaving a side alley unguarded. By the time the freighter edged into its berth, Ukraine's reconnaissance teams knew the ship's exact timing, the disposition of missiles and radars around the port, and the best windows in coverage. That level of clarity was the decisive advantage. Where Moscow trusted layers of steel and electronics, Kyiv built its plan on data, patience, and hidden movement, which raised the next problem. Intelligence alone couldn't destroy $22 million of cargo. Russia's layered SAM grid was still active, still capable of shooting down almost anything flying straight in. The question turned from knowledge to execution. How do you create a hole in a defense net designed to catch every inbound target? The answer started with distraction. Ukraine's solution was the decoy lead strike. A setup built around 3 drones. 2 J-22 airborne decoys went in first, their only function to force Russian systems into reaction. Behind them came the strike element, the LUTN-196, carrying a 165-pound shaped charge meant to punch through steel cargo hulls. The plan was simple in form but exact in timing. The decoys existed to die, clearing a path that the real weapon could pass through unseen. Russian defenses looked more than capable. Buk-M3 batteries scanned the harbor's approaches. Pantsir-S1 point defense units stood close in, ready to swat down anything that slipped through at low altitude. Operators were trained on linear drills: detect, lock, fire, expecting that any drone in range could be erased in seconds. Against a lone UAV, the system was confident. The first step was to flip that confidence into distraction. The J-22 decoys pushed higher and faster, broadcasting amplified signatures. Their onboard systems exaggerated their radar reflection, deliberately screaming, "Presence." To Russian radar screens, they looked like obvious threats, large enough to demand priority. Consoles lit, tracks pulled forward, target queues filled. Exactly the reaction Ukraine wanted. Then electronic warfare lit up the spectrum. Operators began detecting jamming in the 2.4 GHz band, traced later to a Lyre 3 EW unit mounted on a Kamaz truck in the container yard east of the port. One decoy faltered as its link degraded, spilling off course, wobbling in the night sky. To Russian eyes on the ground, that sputter appeared to be a success. But the second decoy powered on, climbing higher, holding the illusion alive. Within moments, a Pantsir-S1 kicked into action. Crews locked onto the intruders and launched 2 57E6 interceptors. Both decoys were destroyed in under 20 seconds, their fragile airframes blown apart and scattered into the harbor airspace. For Russian operators, the sequence felt clean: detect, jam, intercept, confirm. 2 threats entered, 2 threats eliminated. The board looked clear, but the real point wasn't about the kills. It was about the interval that followed. Radars had been pulled upward, narrow-band jammers had fired, short-range launchers had expended ordnance, and operators checked boxes with their eyes still fixed on where the decoys had been. That was the opening, the blind corridor. Layered radars always overlap, but seams exist where one beam ends and another begins. Timing and angle let the LUTN-196 exploit one such seam just as operators were resetting after the false engagement. Banking off its initial path at 17 degrees, it cut across the fractured coverage line, sliding under radar sweep. For a moment, the harbor's vast defensive web had a hole, invisible to those watching their screens. The drone used that seam with precision. It adjusted course, dropped to a lower altitude, and pressed into the gap. No alarms rose. No interceptors followed. Radar scopes cycled back, resyncing after the false contacts, while the attack UAV sank deeper into its blind track. That corridor wasn't permanent. It existed only for a few minutes, just enough time for the attacker to close distance. The LUTN-196 was now aligned on Port Olia 4 in perfect range without a single defensive system recognizing the threat. This was the knife edge of the operation. 2 expendable airframes had shifted an entire port's defenses for a handful of seconds. That pause was long enough for the strike drone to line up a target worth millions. The defenders believed they had won, unaware that the real attack had already slipped through. And when the LUTN-196 finally broke from cover, what it carried was more than just a warhead. It was about to test whether one shaped charge could cripple an entire port facility. At 3:49 a.m., the strike unfolded. The LUTN-196, carrying a 165-pound shaped charge, dove at roughly 130 miles per hour into the port side of Port Olia 4. The impact was surgical, low along the engineering bay where fuel tanks sat close to bulkheads. One heartbeat, it was silent. The next, a jet of molten particles drove straight through the hull, breaching steel never designed to withstand that kind of directed force. This was what the warhead was built to do. Unlike conventional explosives that dissipate energy outward, a shaped charge channels its blast into a narrow jet moving at extreme velocity. Against reinforced armor or hardened shelters, the effect is penetration instead of diffusion. On Port Olia 4, it tore through compartments, ruptured tanks, and set the conditions for a firestorm. A single breach now pressed against hundreds of highly volatile munitions stacked in confined holds. The cargo on board was no ordinary freight. The manifest was worth about $22 million. Analysts assessing imagery and blast data concluded that several hundred Shahed UAVs, at least 300, possibly more, were stored inside. Each carried its own explosive payload and fuel. As fire ripped across compartments, one after another began to cook off, turning a lone-shaped charge into the match that lit an entire stockpile. The first eruption dwarfed the initiating strike. A fireball rose more than 330 feet in the air, blanketing the port in light. The harbor skyline was illuminated like noon, every crane, warehouse, and pier line thrown into sharp contrast. Within minutes, at least 15 secondary explosions rattled through the docks as drone warheads, fuel reservoirs, and shipping containers went off in sequence. The cascade gutted everything nearby. Cranes toppled as support frames fractured under the concussive wave. Truck convoys waiting on the pier ignited one by one, their fuel tanks adding to the expanding torch. Warehouse rooftops peeled as internal fires leapt outward. Energy rolled through the port in constant cycles. Fire, blast, collapse. To residents miles away, it sounded like sustained artillery. By the 15-minute mark, the vessel itself was collapsing. Stern compartments burned uncontrolled, flames pouring through ruptured decks. The bow sagged into the water as firefighting systems failed and compartments flooded. Port Olia 4 was no longer a cargo carrier, but a blazing hull, tilting and cracking under its own destruction. What had been a critical link in Russia's supply chain had been erased in a quarter of an hour. The asymmetry cut sharply. The LUTN-196 cost less than a consumer car to produce. What it destroyed was measured in the tens of millions. Shade stockpiles intended to fuel weeks of strikes on Ukraine's grid, substations, and depots. A low-cost strike UAV had just punched far outside its weight, wiping out inventories Moscow had counted as secure. That is why this wasn't just about a ship on fire. It was about balance sheets flipped upside down in a war where Economics matter as much as explosives. The blast didn't stay confined to the pier. Shockwaves rolled out more than 12 miles. In Astrakhan, windows shattered and alarms rang. People reported it as an earthquake at first before seeing the glow on the horizon. Evacuation orders spread as officials scrambled to understand what hit them. On the shoreline, smoke columns towered, captured by satellites within hours. Moscow's initial response showed the scale of impact. For half a day, state media claimed it was a warehouse fire, but the damage was too obvious to conceal. Satellite images confirmed an obliterated vessel and pier, 3 warped and blackened. The official narrative unraveled almost as quickly as the port itself. By dawn, Port Olia wasn't functioning. Supply lines from the Caspian had been severed, at least temporarily. Hundreds of Shahed drones, planned for launch against Ukraine's infrastructure, were ash and twisted wreckage. Russia didn't just lose a ship, it lost weeks of strike capacity in one hit. That is the definition of strategic consequence delivered through tactical precision. One drone, one warhead, and a short blind corridor cut a major artery in Russia's logistics. The lesson reached beyond fire and smoke. It showed that defenses thought airtight could be cracked, and once pierced, their losses extended far into the battlefield. What that meant for Russia's wider campaign was only beginning to surface. But for those watching the Caspian, it was proof that even a highly defended corridor could be breached. And that revelation reshaped the conversation about how secure supply lines really are. One cheap drone forced Moscow to face the truth. Its Caspian defenses could be bypassed. Strength on paper meant little once a real strike found its way through. The impact wasn't just material. Within hours, Moscow locked Port Olia for 72 hours, suspended drone shipments across the Caspian, and rushed in extra Pantsir-S1 batteries with Podlet K1 radars to plug the gap. What looked secure now demanded a full re-evaluation of logistics and air defenses. A single low-cost drone turned supply into vulnerability, and that shifts the calculations for both sides. If this analysis matters to you, like and subscribe.